What would you do if your mission had a 100% casualty rate? Just what would it feel like to be told you are going into a situation that nobody comes back from? For thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of Russian troops, this is their reality on the battlefield. But leaked video from one of these human wave attacks shows us just what it's like moments before going into the battle. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's get into it. Okay, so this is coming to us leaked out of a group called Wind of Change Research Group, passed to us by a Twitter account called Igor Shushko. And I will say that I can't verify the truth of this video, but what I will say is that it does appear accurate on the surface. And I'll explain why I think so, but let's listen to what the commander here is telling this grouping of troops.
Знайте одно. Нас, мать Россия, никогда не забудет.
Okay, so one, kind of wild to be like, all of you will die. That's pretty stark. But one of the things I want to point out is, first off, notice a couple of details here. Notably, there's a pretty wide variety of different types of helmets, and they appear to be worn in kind of different fashions, right? You notice that some of them, this person appears to be wearing his helmet over a hat. This person appears to not be wearing a helmet at all and is covering his face in a mask. Some of these helmets appear to have some patches on it, right? Here's someone who put a Z patch on their helmet. Notice also there's a lack of uniformity among uniforms. This person is wearing what's called a Gorka suit. This is a Soviet-era windsuit that's actually a very effective military uniform. I actually use one as kind of a coat, like a cold, wet weather overcoat. But you notice this soldier here has a UCP patterned overcoat. And there's, of course, not really a standardized gear set. It does look like they all seem to have similar magazine pouches. They all look like they have at least 3 magazines. But notice this here. This looks like an AKM or possibly an AK-74. Very basic, right? Wooden stock, something we haven't seen since the 70s. Standard red Bakelite handle. Again, Bakelite is a Soviet-era weapon system, or like pseudoplastic used in some of their materials. But an iron sights. So this is an extremely basic rifle. Nobody's got eye protection. Just this looks, and what you also see, very few of these people have old gear. Right? There's very few signs of use that I can see. You compare it to Ukrainian soldiers who oftentimes have gear that looks pretty battered and pretty battle worn. And to me, this is an indicator that this is not just their last mission, it may also be their first. And of course, one of the biggest reasons I think this is authentic is because this is a KAMAZ. This is a Russian-made transport vehicle, and it's something we've seen a lot of in Ukrainian drone videos. And oftentimes these KAMAZs will get hit with drones, and you'll see the troops kind of flee in all directions and then get hunted down by drones or artillery units.
Всем нам будут еще столетия нести цветы к нашим именам.
What I want to know is, who's this guy? Because you notice, right, for most people, most soldiers won't really accept a certain death mission. I say that if, sometimes there are like soldiers who find themselves in situations where the only resolution is a soldier like knowingly sacrificing themselves with like 100% certainty of being KIA. But usually it's for reasons that are directly related. So for example, limited spots on a transport plane, or a need to cover a withdrawal while their battle buddies leave. Those are situations where you do see soldiers embark on missions, formal or informal, that are 100% likely to result in their becoming casualties. But you don't usually see it with this level of organization. And he uses the word we, which implies he too is in on this, which is even more fascinating because it's pretty rare to have an officer lead, also plan, and then execute a 100% casualty mission. For most military formations, losing an entire platoon would be considered a military disaster.
Каждое имя бойца будет высечено на доске обелисков. Нам всем зажгут вечные огни.
Jesus, this is so dark. I want to point out a few other things. First off, our no helmet guy, his helmet's right here, actually. It's just hooked onto his gear. This is something that actually a more experienced soldier might do. And so one of the things I think we're looking at here is actually a Russian Storm Z unit. And Storm Z units are penal units, right? These are penal units established by Russia after Wagner Group was dissolved. Of course, Storm Z actually was then disbanded and replaced with Storm V units. But it's not clear that these units were actually dissolved or if this was just symbolic sort of card games, right? Because Storm Z reputations were so bad as being high casualty units, they created Storm Vs, which were also high casualty units. But these are all the same thing. They're penal military units, which is the units where basically encompass two types of soldiers. The first is prisoners, right? Non-military members recruited from Russian prisons on the premises, promising that completion of service would result in a reduction of their sentence. And of course, they'd be earning $2,200 a month. But each company, right, consists of about 100 men, broken into 4 squads of 10 person each, 4 fire support squads, and a 2-person command element. So a very rudimentary command structure. And generally, for more sophisticated militaries, they have to have a big command tree because a highly trained squad is going to have a different mission, right? A weapon squad will have a different mission from a machine gun squad versus a light squad. If there's a mechanized infantry, right? Specialty roles really make a difference. But when you're talking about human wave attacks, where there's not a lot of specialization, you don't need an elaborate system of NCOs, right? From team leaders to squad leaders to platoon leaders and platoon sergeants. When you have very rudimentary tactics like go forward, kill the enemy in front of you, you can have this very light command structure of just 6 or 7 squad leaders plus a 2-person officer command team. Right. And these Storm Z companies, which I imagine Storm V is just a repeat of, right. These prisoners get 10 to 15 days of training before being sent into combat. Some of them, it's interesting. Some of them I didn't realize are hidden behind different names, like the 8th Guards Combined Army, 1st Army Corps, or the DPR. But what's also interesting is that the other source of meat for this meat grinder is punishment for soldiers found to be abusing drugs and alcohol, are oftentimes sent to Storm Z detachments. The belief, at least in the Battle of Avdiivka, was that Storm Z units take between 40 and 70% losses. Losses, remember, can be both wounded or killed. But there's a lot of really interesting sort of data. At the time that Storm Z was disbanded, Mediazona, a Russian opposition media outlet, and BBC said that around 10,000 or around 8,000 Storm Z convicts were confirmed to have been killed. But of course, they just changed their name. It's not like there was an end to these units. And the fact of this looks exactly like you would expect from a Storm Z unit, right? These are likely Russian prisoners, folks who've been sent to prison and have this is their only chance to not die there in a Russian penal colony. And the handful of folks who look a bit more experienced, like this guy here who's got his helmet properly hooked up to his gear, and he looks like somebody who knows how to act before a mission. And he also the mask, this all just looks like he looks like a more professional soldier. So he may have been a professional soldier who was caught abusing drugs or alcohol, or may have just run afoul of his command, maybe offered a little too many opinions about his command's decisions. And as a result, he was reassigned to this Storm Z unit. But again, so many of these guys just look like they've never worn a helmet in their lives. And that tracks. 10 to 15 days of training, a rifle that's older than many of our grandfathers, or at least my parents. Very, very typical for what I would imagine a Storm Z unit looks like. But here's the problem, right? Here's the issue, is that there's actually been some data into just the casualty rates. And BBC actually does a really good job of using open source data to track confirmed casualties. And they use things like public obituaries. They use things like actual satellite images of military graves, military cemeteries. And as you can see here from this chart, right? Regular fighters or trained soldiers, they call them civilian recruits. Likely these are, that's a term for prisoners who get recruited into the military with limited training. And I think that's a good term for them because, again, you don't lose your status as a civilian if you get 15 days of military training, right? So you have these regular fighters, and you can see that Russia actually has been working harder and harder over time to ensure that their highly trained military personnel are much less likely to incur casualties. And because think about it, in 15 days, if you're one of these guys, you can't train one of these guys to operate artillery. Artillery is a pretty specialized piece of equipment. You're likely not even going to be able to train them to maintain a tank or operate a drone or do any number of sophisticated battlefield tasks. Instead, they're likely going to have very limited roles and limited capabilities, and you're going to assign them to roles commensurate with that. So the Russian strategy has said, listen, when we invest in a soldier enough to teach them to to be an artillery crew member, a fairly technical job, we try our best to preserve the combat power. We don't want them to become casualties. We need them to stay alive because it's so comparatively expensive to train them. But you can also see that, again, here's the start of the new year, the start of this Avdiivka offensive. You saw that a huge spike happened in Russian civilian recruits and unknowns, right? People who had an unclear background. This huge spike only occurs for for civilian recruits and unknown background. There's not really a corresponding spike with the professional soldier class. And I think that's a function of the fact that Russia has realized that its strategy hinges on high casualty, low skill infantry frontal assaults supported a good distance away by pilots, high skill drone operators, and artillery crews, right? And so I think that's what you see, right? These guys barely experienced a change during the Battle of Avdiivka. They barely saw more casualties. But if you were a Storm Z or Storm V unit, you almost doubled your confirmed casualties. And again, possibly even tripled it if you were to rope in these unknown soldiers, these unknown background soldiers. And you can see that while the Avdiivka offensive's culmination has kind of, sort of, a little bit reduced casualties, Russia's kept them high, right? The only time we've seen higher casualties was during the Battle of Bakhmut right here. This was probably the high watermark of like the Wagner group. And it's a reflection of the fact that to the BBC, they've confirmed the death toll is around at least 50,000. And they believe it's much higher, right? Probably because here's two examples of kind of the end state of this this attack. You can see here's a Russian military cemetery. And you can see right now the cemetery is empty. It's got 2 other cemeteries adjacent to it. But now you can see they've basically filled several city blocks of graves. You can see these individual cars here. And literally they are the size of, each of these is about the size of a city block, several car lengths in each direction. So you understand that they've created graves for probably tens of thousands of troops in this site alone. And this was taken April 2023. Remember, if the Russian system, if you were killed in April 2023, you're likely not going to be buried for another month or more. So this is why I think being one of these soldiers in the meat grinder, so to speak, is so punishing. And honestly, even the BBC acknowledges that 50,000 number is what they know for sure. There's got to be a lot of soldiers who are listed instead as unknown, some of whom there may not even be documentation that they're serving in Ukraine at all. So what I want to do real quick, because I think this is important, is to draw a comparison between this fighting and D-Day to give you a scale of the Russian willingness to kill their own troops. And before I do, if you want to see why these attacks are so high casualty, you have to look at the Ukrainian tactics. And the problem is I can't do it here on YouTube. YouTube won't let me show you any kind of combat footage. This video, I will have to manually request YouTube review it because the algorithm will simply see men in uniform and will instantly demonetize it. So if you want to see that uncensored combat footage and my deep dive analysis of it, every week, twice a week, I find the viral combat footage coming at us from the front lines, the battles that are going on in real time. And I find that footage, oftentimes it's only 24 hours old, and we do an analysis of the tactics. And once you do it, you understand the brutal reality that these guys are being put into. But it's for members only because, again, YouTube sponsors, they do not want to touch this channel. And so I depend on you guys, the members, to support me. So any one of these tiers is going to get you access to the videos. But again, if you want to support the lieutenant tier or the colonel tier level, I appreciate you so much. And I shout you guys out at the end of every video. But every one of you guys, it means the world to me that you guys are out here supporting what I do, right? So that's combatvetnews.com. Check us out. Now, here's D-Day. D-Day, one of the largest operations, and actually, in terms of scale, roughly comparable to the Russian so-called special military operation, right? Right. If you look up Russian troops deployed to Ukraine, let's see if we can find this here. I believe the number is right around 500,000. So the Royal Services Institute, right? This is from a little bit ago. Let's see if we can find the Russian military capacity. Russian military, as of June 2023, has about 400,000 troops in Ukraine. And they expect that number actually, as of 2024, is going to rise to about 500,000 troops. Now, in contrast, D-Day, 850,000 men. So the Russian military operation about half of a D-Day. And yet, the casualty rates are something that would make even the highest casualty beach of D-Day blush. And here's what I mean. Omaha Beach was the most brutal of the D-Day beaches you could land at. And at that landing operation, the first 24 hours, not even 24, the first 8 hours, or 8 to 12 hours by nightfall, 34,000 troops assaulted Omaha Beach on that first day. And American casualties, 2,400. Which is a lot. Nearly 1 in 10 of the troops that landed there became a casualty. Bear in mind, casualty, wounded and dead. So 10%, right? And that's the worst of the beaches. At Utah Beach, right, only 197 men were killed or wounded out of 23,000. On Gold Beach, 400 killed or wounded out of 25,000. And out of 21,000 men on Juno Beach, 1,200 were injured. So about 5% So really, you are looking at these guys are looking at a casualty rate, again, 40 to 70%. That is 2 or 3 times that of the hardest hit beach on D-Day. And so I say these things because this context really helps you understand that Russia is willing to kill a lot of people. I don't know how else to put it. And I think for the Russian government, I think recruiting from prisoners with life sentences looks like an economically good decision for them because those prisoners are never going to become taxpayers, right? They're tax users. They use taxpayer resources for food and housing. Admittedly, they're in a prison camp, right? But the Russian government can achieve one of its strategic objectives in Ukraine and discharge a tax burden by killing them. So this is the kind of horrible, grisly, dystopian math that someone like Putin can make when you have a state like the Russian state. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. A huge thank you to the members of combatvetnews.com, especially those colonel tier members and those lieutenant tier members. I could not do this without you guys. Hit like on the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.